Thank you for that excellent children's time with the children. Unfortunately, it essentially blew the first paragraph of my sermon, including the joke with just a twist to it. But because I have some background in education, and I know you need to hear things over and over to really absorb them, I'm going to go ahead and give you the whole thing anyway. Have you ever heard the question, have you stopped cheating on your taxes? It's a trick question, because if you say yes, it is an admission that you once cheated on your taxes, and yes, at some point in your time with the children, I wondered if you had hacked into my computer. If you say no, it sounds as if you are still cheating on your taxes. Sometimes trick questions are asked in fun, but the Pharisees and the Herodians were not joking around with their question. I can almost see them kind of rubbing their hands and grinning like a Cheshire cat as they buttered up Jesus first with their flattery, and then they thought they were setting the trap and snapping it closed, but they found to their surprise that when it snapped closed, they were the ones caught in it instead of Jesus. Sincere questions are an important part of a dialogue, but trick questions, such as the one posed to Jesus, are more likely to be found in what is really intended as a duel. At this point in his ministry, the Jewish religious hierarchy intended for this conversation to end in at least Jesus' arrest, but preferably in his death. That was the setting in which Jesus recognized their trickery and asked for a coin. Now, in order for you to understand Jesus' shrewdness in asking for a coin, I have to make a little historical diversion. You probably know that the Roman Empire ruled Israel, but probably like me, you really weren't aware of how even the coins used in daily life reinforced that control. In an essay titled Archaeology of the Land of Israel at the Time of Jesus, Jody Magnus wrote, "Coins were not only useful for financial transactions, they also served as easily seen propaganda. Figures and inscriptions reminded the users of their government, their cultural identity, and their religious practices. When Rome conquered Jerusalem, it minted its own coins. The well-known Judea Copta coins, meaning conquered Judea, were named for their inscription, which depicted the emperor on one side and on the reverse, a young woman mourning beneath a date palm tree and a man with his hands tied behind his back." Can you imagine being reminded every time you took out a coin to pay for something that you were part of a defeated vassal state? As galling as that would be in itself, handling that coin that had the image of the Roman emperor with the inscription Lord on the other side of it would also feel very close to idolatry to faithful first-century Jews. And perhaps that is why Jesus had to ask someone else for a coin, as he responded to the question with a little act of show and tell. Now, to be honest, I never really thought too much about his action of having to ask someone else, and I've preached on this sermon a good number of times in 40 years of ministry. But even old preachers can learn new insights, and so this was a new approach to this sermon for me. I happen to lead the Independent Living Bible Study at Homewood at Frederick, where my husband Bob and I live. And in that class, we study the suggested readings for the lectionary each week. And I especially appreciate our discussions since we come from diverse Christian backgrounds. So I always prepare for the class by doing the traditional kind of, looking up what the commentaries say. And I often read the article called In the Lectionary that is in the Christian Century magazine as I'm preparing for the class. And the author of the article for this Sunday focused on that very fact, that Jesus did not have a coin himself. After the author mentioned the many different Christian influences she had lived under herself, ranging from a Presbyterian Sunday school to a conservative Baptist school in which every day began with both the Pledge of Allegiance to the American flag and the Pledge of Allegiance to the Christian flag and the Pledge of Allegiance to the Bible, to the flag representing the Bible, the woman now attends a Mennonite church in which there is no flag at all. Carrie Hassler Brooks, the author of the article, then goes on to say that she can no longer accept that Jesus was suggesting that we can neatly divide our lives between our faith and our civic duty, lining the demands up in parallel columns. She goes on to say, when I read Matthew 22, a chorus of radically different voices are in my head. I have come to understand Jesus as a loud protester against unjust systems of power, a divine voice for lived peace and material justice-making, a radical lover of people. I take seriously the absence of a denarius in Jesus' own hand. And yet, she goes on, I also understand that many people read this passage very differently than I do. Some read it as a call into godly relationship with both nation and empire. Others as a call to speak and live against the corruptions of nation and empire. I am concerned with what is right and true about this passage, of course, but I am also concerned about the people who come to this passage. I think the important thing is to read this passage in community, open to the possibility of different meanings, humble about our own understanding and misunderstanding, and committed to do justice and love mercy as we follow both the words and the life of Jesus. Let me read that final sentence again. My brother and sister-in-law are here, and we come from a very diverse religious family, so these words resonate with me. I think the important thing is to read this passage in community, open to the possibility of different meanings, humble about our own understanding and misunderstanding, and committed to do justice and love mercy as we follow both the words and the life of Jesus. I'm pretty sure that the strident duels going on in our nation and in our government at this time contributed to my noticing the difference between the Pharisees' style of challenging Jesus and Moses' style of conversing with God. And that in turn led to my naming the sermon Dialogues or Duels. So let's go back to the passage from Exodus. Moses and God had been through a lot together, and I believe it is safe to say that even though Moses knew he was nowhere near God's equal, he did understand that he had permission to speak directly and even bluntly to God. So when God announced to Moses that an angel would now be leading them, a real act of delegation of authority on God's part, well, Moses was not happy with that. He believed that God's promise had been that God's self, would lead them to the promised land. God was ready to move on to other things because God, the way it's portrayed in Scripture, just wasn't sure that God could take another one of the Israelites' stunts at that point. Moses, of course, took exception to that. He did not sulk. He did not shout. He did not try to trap God with trick questions. Instead, he calmly reminded God of the promises God made in the past. Moses showed that he had really been listening to God because he remembered the promises God had made. He also showed that he respected God and that he expected God to keep divine promises. God responded by saying, "I will do the very thing that you have asked for. You have found favor in my sight, and I know you by name." And I know you by name. Now, in the ancient world, that was not just a way of saying, "Oh, yes, we've been introduced," or, "I noticed your name tag." Knowing someone by name meant having a deep knowledge of them and trusting them enough to share some of your power with them, because there was believed to be power in knowing a person by name. And that is why taking God's name, meaning to use it in a way that disrespects or misrepresents God's character, is forbidden in the Ten Commandments. Moses and God were in a dialogue, an intimate conversation that involved a history of having listened to each other and of having honored the character of each that had been revealed in that relationship. And this prompted Moses to ask another favor of God. Moses asked God to show him God's glory. But here God could not agree, because after all, God knew Moses' human limitations and was not going to put him in danger. However, God did have compassion. God understood Moses' longing to know God even more intimately, so God offered a compromise. Wish our Congress could understand that concept. God offered a compromise that fulfilled as much of Moses' desire as would be beneficial to Moses. Dialogue, compassion, and compromise. How we long for those virtues to be practiced in our world. As disciples of Jesus, we are called to initiate that process rather than to turn our differences into duels. Earlier, I quoted Jeanette Strandford, and I returned to the sermon that quote came from, a sermon that I originally wrote way back in 2002. I confessed to my brother this morning that yes, I do have those old sermons, and yes, I do pull them out and I do revise them, but sometimes they're no longer appropriate. Unfortunately, this one was still appropriate 20 years later. So, back to Jeanette Strandford. She writes, "One of the first things we can take away from our Matthew passage is that there is room for debate in the Christian community. There is room for tolerance of diversity of opinion about issues that relate to government and the church, to civic duty and Christian duty. Christians who have searched scriptures, prayed, and thought about an issue may end up with contradicting opinions and practices, but they are still Christians, and I'd like to expand that to they are still people of faith and children of God." Here's a second insight from our passage. Strandford writes, "Jesus does not dismiss the emperor. There is a place for government and political leaders in our world. God can work through government and leaders. Finally, Jesus' answer puts everything in context for God's people of every time and place, just as your little session here on the steps this morning did. That context is God's claim on everything that God has made. Every other claim is limited by this claim. Blind obedience to any leader or state is idolatry. Only God is worthy of total commitment and faith. And God and country must not be confused as the same thing." Jesus' answer to the Pharisees that day points out just how separate these two can be. The Pharisees wanted a simple answer. They received a truthful one instead. Jesus called them, and Jesus calls us to wrestle with the truth, but not to evade or distort it for personal benefit or in an attempt to trap an opponent. Our faithful response is to find the truth through intimate dialogue with God and with others who earnestly seek an honest answer. Amen.